The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like the whole sky had cracked open. I was standing on the balcony of my apartment in Denver, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint the mountains orange, when the light above me turned white and then red. I did not understand what I was looking at. Then the shockwave hit 3 seconds later and threw me back through my own door. My name is Ethan Cross. I was 26 years old, a reserve pilot for the Earth Defense Corps, a job I had taken because it paid well, and I never thought I would actually fly in real combat. That morning changed everything. I crawled to the window and looked up. 6 massive ships, each one bigger than a mountain, hung in the sky above the city. They were not shaped like anything human. They looked like black knives, curved and sharp, with lines of red light running along their hulls like veins. I did not know it then, but those ships were only the first wave. Behind them, hidden beyond the moon, waited a fleet larger than anything Earth had ever imagined. The species that sent them called themselves the Vorin. They had crossed thousands of light years to reach us, and they had done it because their scouts told them Earth was weak, unarmed, and easy to take. They were wrong. But I did not know that yet either. All I knew was that the city around me was burning. I ran downstairs, my hands shaking, my ears still ringing from the blast. People filled the streets, screaming, running in every direction, not knowing where safety was because there was no safety anywhere. A woman grabbed my arm and asked me what was happening. I had no answer for her. I had never seen a war. None of us had. Not a real one. Not like this. My phone buzzed with an emergency alert from Earth Defense Corps. All active and reserve pilots were ordered to report to the nearest base immediately. My hands would not stop shaking as I read it. I looked up one more time at those black ships hanging silently above the clouds, and I felt something cold settle into my chest. Not just fear. Something else. Anger, maybe. Or the beginning of it. I made it to Peterson Base 20 minutes later, driving through streets filled with wreckage and stopped cars. The base itself was in chaos. Fighters were being pulled out of hangars faster than ground crews could check them. Officers shouted orders that contradicted each other. Nobody had trained for this. Nobody had believed this day would ever come. A woman I recognized from training exercises grabbed my shoulder. Her name was Mia Bennett, a pilot 2 years older than me, calm in a way that felt strange given everything around us. They hit 6 cities at once, she said. London, Tokyo, Cairo, Mumbai, Sydney, and here. No warning. No demand, just fire. Why? I asked, though I already suspected there was no good answer. Because they think we can't fight back, she said. Let's prove them wrong. We were given 10 minutes to prep before launch. 10 minutes to say goodbye to the life I had known, though I did not have time to think of it that way then. I climbed into the cockpit of an interceptor that had been built for training exercises, not war, and I felt the engines roar to life beneath me. As we lifted off, I saw the city spread out below. Smoke rising from a dozen different points, and for the first time I understood the size of what was happening. This was not an attack on one nation. This was an attack on our entire species. The Vorin had not come to negotiate. They had come to conquer. Our squadron leader, a tired-sounding man named Lucas Grant, gave us our orders over the comm. We are outnumbered and outgunned, he said. But we are not out of options. Follow my lead, stay tight, and remember, they don't know how we fight yet. Let's make sure they never forget it. The first real battle of my life began less than a minute later, when 3 enemy fighters broke formation and came straight for us. They moved with a strange, perfect precision, like they were following a script written long before this war began. I realized quickly that the Vorin fought in patterns, rehearsed and predictable, because every species they had ever fought before had crumbled fast enough that improvisation was never necessary. Mia broke that pattern immediately. Instead of matching their formation like the tactical computer suggested, she dove low, skimming just above the rooftops of the city, forcing one of the enemy fighters to break off its perfect formation to follow her. I understood what she was doing and followed her lead, banking hard into a narrow street between 2 towers, something no sane pilot would attempt in a straight fight. The enemy fighter chasing me hesitated for half a second, unsure how to react to a maneuver that broke every rule of standard aerial combat. That hesitation cost it its wing, torn off by a support cable strung between the 2 buildings that I had barely avoided myself. It was not skill that saved me in that moment. It was desperation shaped into creativity. I would learn, in the days that followed, that this difference between us and them would decide everything. The battle above Denver lasted 11 minutes. We lost 4 pilots. The Vorin lost 7 fighters, a number that should have been impossible against a fleet as advanced as theirs. When the black ships finally pulled back into orbit, retreating rather than pressing their advantage, I sat in my cockpit, shaking, staring at the smoke rising from my city, and I understood something that would define the rest of the war. They had not expected resistance. Not real resistance, not the kind that bent the rules instead of following them. And that meant, somewhere far above us, in ships built to conquer 100 worlds without difficulty, someone was recalculating everything they thought they knew about the small blue planet they had just attacked. I landed back at base with my hands still trembling, my flight suit soaked through with sweat, and Mia met me on the tarmac, her face pale but her eyes sharp. "First round is over," she said. "They'll be back. And next time, they won't hold back." She was right. But she was also wrong about one thing. When the Vorin came back, they would not be the only ones who stopped holding back. Around the base, medics moved between wounded pilots and ground crew, doing what they could with equipment never designed for a war of this scale. I watched a young technician, barely out of training, hold pressure on another man's arm, with hands that would not stop shaking, and I understood that everyone here was the same as me. Ordinary people who had been asked, in the space of one morning, to become something else entirely. Commander Grant called us together an hour later, in a hangar with one wall blown open to the sky, smoke still curling from the wreckage of a fighter that had not made it back. He did not give us a speech about glory or destiny. He simply told us the truth. Earth had no allies, no one was coming to help us. Every nation on the planet had lost ships and cities in the first strike, and the enemy fleet above us was only a fraction of what waited beyond the moon. "We are alone," he said. "But alone does not mean weak. It means we decide everything for ourselves, with no one else to blame, and no one else to save us. That is not a curse. That is the only advantage we have left." I did not feel brave when he said that. I felt small, and tired, and afraid, in a way I had never known before. But something in his words settled into me anyway, next to the anger that had started the moment I saw those ships above my city. We would fight because there was nothing else to do, and somewhere in that fight, something in me had already begun to change. That night, I could not sleep. I sat on the edge of my cot in a barracks filled with pilots too exhausted or too afraid to speak, and I thought about the black ships, the red veins of light running across their hulls, and the strange precision of the enemy pilots who had never expected a fight like the one we gave them. I thought about the cold calculation in their attack. 6 cities struck at once, a demonstration of power meant to end any hope of resistance before it began. They had wanted us to surrender before we understood what surrender even meant. Instead, they had given every person on this planet a single shared reason to stand together for the first time in human history. I did not know it then, lying awake in that damaged hangar with the smell of smoke still in the air, but the Vorin had made a mistake that would follow them across the galaxy for years to come. They had attacked a species that did not know how to give up. Far above the atmosphere, hidden in the dark beyond the moon, Vorin commanders reviewed the footage of the battle over Denver, and over London, and over every other city that had drawn blood from their forces that day. I would learn much later what they said in those meetings, translated and shared with us by allies we did not yet know we had. They called the resistance a statistical anomaly, an unexpected variable, nothing more. They were already wrong, and the galaxy, watching from a careful distance, had already begun to notice. 3 days after the first strike, I finally understood how small our world truly was in the eyes of the ones who attacked it. I was sitting in a briefing room at Peterson Base, along with 40 other pilots, when Commander Grant played us an intercepted transmission. The voice on the recording was not human, translated by software that struggled to keep pace with a language built on tones and pauses instead of words. Still, the meaning came through clear enough to chill every person in that room. The speaker referred to Earth as Designation 742, a world catalogued decades ago by Vorin scouts and marked as suitable for harvesting, not conquest in the way I understood it. Harvesting. Resources, land, and whatever labor could be extracted from a species too primitive to resist. I remember the silence that followed those words. 40 pilots, all of us barely out of training, realizing that our planet had been nothing more than an entry in someone else's ledger for years, before any of us knew the Vorin existed. Grace Turner, a strategist who had been pulled from a university research position into military command within 72 hours of the invasion, stood at the front of the room and explained what she had pieced together from the wreckage of 2 downed enemy fighters and the intercepted communications. The Vorin Empire, she told us, was not new to this. They had conquered dozens of worlds across a stretch of the galaxy so vast, it made our own solar system look like a single grain of sand on an endless beach. Every world they had taken, she explained, had fallen the same way. A show of overwhelming force, enough to shatter morale before real resistance could organize. Most species, faced with weapons and ships beyond anything they had ever built, simply surrendered. Some fought for a while and lost anyway. None of them, as far as the Vorin record suggested, had done what we did over Denver 3 days earlier. They didn't lose 7 fighters in 11 minutes anywhere else, Grace said, tapping a datapad that displayed a graph of Vorin military history, stretching back what looked like centuries. Not once. Not against any species on this list. We are the first. I sat with that thought for a long time after the briefing ended. We were the first. Not the strongest, not the most advanced, not even close. But somehow, in 11 minutes of chaos and desperation, we had done something no other conquered world had managed to do. We had made them bleed. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the base with Mia, both of us too restless to stay still. The sky above us was clear for the first time since the attack, no black ships visible, though we all knew they were still up there, waiting, watching, recalculating. Mia had grown quieter since the battle, her usual sharp confidence replaced by something more careful, more thoughtful. "You ever wonder why they didn't just wipe us out from orbit?" she asked, kicking a piece of loose gravel across the tarmac. "They could have. Big enough ships, big enough weapons. One clean strike and it's over." I had wondered the same thing, lying awake those past 2 nights. "Maybe they wanted something left to take," I said. "Can't harvest a planet you've turned into ash." She nodded slowly. "That's what Grace thinks too. They want the planet mostly intact, resources, people, everything usable. That's why the first strike hit cities but didn't level them completely. It was meant to break our spirit, not our infrastructure." The thought made my stomach turn in a way the battle itself had not. They had not simply attacked us. They had planned to keep us, the way a farmer keeps livestock, useful only for what could be taken from us. It was almost worse than an attack meant to destroy. This was an attack meant to own. That evening, Commander Grant called the senior pilots and strategists together for a different kind of briefing, one that would define the direction of the entire war effort going forward. He explained that Earth's governments, after decades of division and rivalry, had finally agreed to something none of them had managed before. A single unified command structure, drawing resources, soldiers and technology from every nation on the planet, with no borders and no separate agendas. The Global Defense Coalition, as it would come to be known, was born not out of diplomacy but out of pure necessity. I remember thinking, as Grant laid out the plan, that it had taken an alien invasion to accomplish something humanity had failed to do on its own for thousands of years. We had unified, not out of hope or idealism, but because the alternative was extinction. It was not a noble reason, but it was a real one. And in that moment, it was enough. Over the following days, I watched Peterson Base transform from a regional facility into the beating heart of a planetary war effort. Engineers arrived from research labs across the world, bringing technology that had been locked away in classified programs for years, finally released now that survival outweighed secrecy. Noah Baxter, a young engineer with a reputation for reckless brilliance, arrived from a lab in Seattle, carrying data drives full of theoretical weapons designs that had never been built because no one believed the threat justifying them would ever arrive. "They're going to be shocked," Noah told me, the first time we spoke, standing in a hangar surrounded by the wreckage of the 2 Voran fighters recovered after the Denver battle. He ran his hand along a section of alien hull plating, his eyes bright with the kind of excitement that felt almost inappropriate given the circumstances. "Their tech is advanced, sure, but it's rigid, built for efficiency against enemies who fight in straight lines. We don't fight in straight lines. We never have." He was right, though none of us fully understood how right, until later. The Voran had built an empire on centuries of predictable conquest, refining their weapons and tactics against species who thought and fought in patterns similar to their own. They had never needed to consider an enemy who solved problems sideways instead of head-on, who found strength in chaos rather than order. Noah's team began working immediately on reverse engineering pieces of the downed fighters, focusing first on their shielding technology and weapon systems. Progress was slow at first, hampered by a total lack of familiarity with the underlying science, but within a week, small breakthroughs began appearing. A modified frequency here, a repurposed power core there, nothing close to matching Voran technology outright, but enough to begin closing the gap that had once seemed impossible to cross. Meanwhile, the war above us had not paused to let us catch our breath. Scattered engagements continued across the globe, smaller skirmishes as Voran scout ships tested different regions, probing for weaknesses in our defenses. I flew in 3 of these engagements over the following 2 weeks, each one teaching me something new about the enemy we faced, and about myself in ways I had not expected. The Voran, I learned, communicated between ships using a rigid command structure, every pilot following orders from a central authority with almost no room for individual decision-making. This made them terrifyingly efficient in situations that matched their training, but it also made them slow to adapt when circumstances shifted outside their expectations. Human pilots, by contrast, had grown up making split-second decisions in everything from traffic to sports to daily survival. It turned out that a lifetime of small, chaotic choices had prepared us for something none of us could have imagined preparing for. During one skirmish over the Pacific, I watched a Voran squadron leader hesitate for nearly 4 full seconds after Mia executed a maneuver that had no equivalent in their combat data. 4 seconds does not sound like much, but in the middle of aerial combat, it was an eternity. That hesitation gave 3 human pilots enough time to flank the enemy formation and take down 2 fighters before the Voron squadron even finished recalculating its strategy. It was becoming clear, battle by battle, that the greatest weapon Earth possessed was not a piece of technology at all. It was unpredictability, born from a species that had never fought a war the same way twice, because we had never had the luxury of a single unbroken tradition of conquest to fall back on. We improvised because improvisation was, in many ways, all we had ever known. Word of these small victories began to spread beyond our own atmosphere sooner than any of us expected. Grace Turner explained to a gathered group of commanders, myself included, that several long-range sensor arrays maintained by other species scattered throughout our sector of the galaxy had likely detected the battles taking place around Earth, species who had, for years, quietly watched the Voron Empire expand and conquer without any real opposition. "They're not going to help us," Grace warned, her voice careful and measured. "Not directly. Not yet, but they're watching. And every battle we survive changes what they think is possible." I did not fully understand the weight of her words until much later, when the first quiet signals of outside interest began reaching us, faint and cautious, from civilizations we had not even known existed a month earlier. For now, all I understood was that the fight above our skies was no longer just about Earth's survival. It had become something the entire galaxy was beginning to notice, a single small world refusing to fall the way every other world had fallen before it. That night, standing outside the barracks with Mia and Noah, watching the stars emerge one by one across a sky that no longer felt safe, I thought about Designation 742, the cold clinical name the Voron had given our planet in their records. I thought about how easily they had assumed we would break, and how wrong that assumption had already proven to be. "They picked the wrong planet," Noah said quietly, almost to himself, staring up at the darkening sky. None of us answered him. We did not need to. Somewhere far above our heads, in ships built to conquer without resistance, the Voron were beginning to understand the same thing, and the galaxy, still watching from a cautious distance, was beginning to wonder if the empire that had never lost a war had finally, by pure chance, chosen an enemy it could not fully predict. 3 weeks into the war, the Voron stopped testing us and began their real invasion. I woke to the sound of every alarm on the base going off at once, a piercing wail that pulled me out of a shallow sleep and straight into my flight suit before my mind had fully caught up with what was happening. Mia was already in the hallway, her hair still messy from sleep, her face tight with the same fear I felt clawing at my own chest. "Full fleet," she said, reading updates on her datapad as we ran toward the hangar. "They're not sending scouts this time. Orbital sensors are picking up over 200 ships breaking formation above the Pacific." 200 ships. The number did not feel real until I stepped outside and looked up, and even then, the sky did not look the way I expected. It looked calm, blue, ordinary, betraying nothing of the storm gathering far above the clouds. Commander Grant met us on the tarmac, his expression grim in a way I had not seen from him before, not even on the first day of the invasion. "This is it," he said, addressing the assembled pilots with a voice that carried none of its usual steadiness. "They're moving against every major coalition base at once. We are not fighting a battle today. We are fighting to survive the next 12 hours." The Global Defense Coalition had spent 3 weeks preparing for exactly this moment, gathering every available fighter, repurposed civilian aircraft, and prototype weapon system Noah's engineering teams had managed to produce. It still did not feel like enough. Nothing could have felt like enough, not against 200 ships crewed by an empire that had never lost a real war. I climbed into my fighter, my hands steadier than they had been during that first chaotic battle over Denver, though my heart pounded just as hard. 3 weeks of combat had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand, hardening something inside me that used to flinch at the idea of violence. I did not enjoy what I had become, but I understood, in that moment, that it might be the only version of myself capable of surviving what was coming. We launched in waves, coordinated across 6 continents through a communication network Noah's team had cobbled together from military satellites and civilian infrastructure alike. As my squadron broke through the cloud layer, I finally saw the true scale of the Voron fleet, and for a moment, every rational thought in my head simply stopped. Ships stretched across the horizon in every direction, black hulls catching the sunlight in sharp, angular reflections, their red veins of light pulsing in unison, like some vast predatory creature breathing before it struck. I had seen 6 of these ships during the first attack, and thought it was the end of the world. 200 felt like something beyond comprehension, a force built to erase rather than conquer. "Hold formation," Grant's voice came through the comm, steady despite everything. "Remember what we learned. They fight in patterns. We don't. Use that." The first wave of enemy fighters broke from the main fleet and descended toward us, hundreds of small angular ships moving with that same eerie, practiced precision I remembered from Denver. But this time, we were ready in a way we had not been before. NOAA's engineers had spent 3 weeks studying Voron communication protocols, and they had found something the enemy never expected us to discover. Voron fighter squadrons relied on a centralized tactical computer aboard their command ships, feeding real-time instructions to every pilot in the fleet. It made them fast, coordinated, and terrifyingly efficient in conventional combat. But it also meant that if you could disrupt that central signal, even for a few seconds, their entire fighting force would be thrown into confusion, each pilot forced to think and react, without the guidance they had relied on for their entire military careers. "Signal jam is live," Noah's voice cut through the comm from his position in a modified command vehicle on the ground. "You've got maybe 90 seconds before they reroute through a backup frequency. Make it count." 90 seconds. I had never fought so hard to make time matter, as I did in those 90 seconds above the Pacific coastline. Enemy fighters that had moved in perfect, deadly formation suddenly scattered, pilots reacting on instinct rather than command, colliding with each other, breaking off attacks halfway through, hesitating in ways that gave us openings we would never have found otherwise. I locked onto an enemy fighter that had frozen mid-maneuver, clearly waiting for instructions that were not coming, and fired before it could recover. The explosion lit up the sky above me, and for the first time since the invasion began, I felt something other than fear pulling at my chest. It felt uncomfortably close to hope. The jamming window closed exactly when Noah warned it would, and the Voron fleet reorganized within seconds, their tactical computers rerouting through channels our sabotage had not anticipated. But 90 seconds had been enough. We had cut deep into their first wave, and more importantly, we had proven that their greatest strength, the perfect coordination that had conquered dozens of worlds before ours, could be turned into a weakness with the right kind of disruption. The battle stretched on for hours, shifting from the skies above the Pacific to engagements across Asia, Europe, and the Americas, as the Voron fleet spread its assault across the entire planet. I lost track of how many times I nearly died that day, how many close calls blurred together into a single continuous stretch of adrenaline and fear. At one point, my fighter took a direct hit that tore through my left wing, sending me into a spiraling descent I only pulled out of through pure instinct and a desperate amount of luck. I landed hard in a field outside a town whose name I never learned, my fighter smoking and unusable, and I sat there for nearly 10 minutes before a ground recovery team found me, too exhausted and too shaken to do anything but stare up at the sky where the battle continued without me. From that field I watched streaks of light crisscross the heavens, human fighters and Voron ships locked in a struggle that would decide the fate of everyone I had ever known. By the time the recovery team pulled me out and got me back into a functioning aircraft, the character of the battle had changed. Grace Turner's strategic planning, combined with Noah's technological sabotage and the raw unpredictability of human pilots, had begun to take a visible toll on the Voron fleet. Ships that had entered the battle with overwhelming confidence now moved with visible caution, formations tightening defensively rather than pressing their advantage offensively. I rejoined the fight over what used to be farmland outside a city in Central Europe, joining a scattered group of pilots from 4 different nations who had banded together after losing contact with their original squadrons. There was no time for introductions beyond call signs shouted quickly over the comm, but within minutes we had formed a functioning unit, coordinating instinctively in a way that would have taken military training months to develop under normal circumstances. War, I was learning, had a way of stripping away everything unnecessary and leaving only what mattered. Nationality, language, background, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was that the pilot beside you was fighting for the same reason you were, and that shared purpose created a kind of unity that felt more real than anything I had known before the invasion began. As the sun began to set, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of orange and red that almost looked beautiful if you did not know what was causing them, the Voron fleet began a slow, deliberate withdrawal. Not a retreat born of surrender, but a calculated pullback, the kind of decision made by a commander recalculating strategy, rather than one accepting defeat. I watched from my cockpit as the black ships gathered themselves back into formation and began climbing away from the atmosphere, leaving behind a battlefield scattered with wreckage from both sides. We had not won, not in any way that felt complete or final, but we had survived, and more than that, we had made them retreat, forced an empire that had never needed to reconsider its strategy to do exactly that. Back at Peterson Base that night, the mood was somber despite the survival of the planet for one more day. The Global Defense Coalition had lost thousands of pilots and ground personnel across the globe. Cities had suffered damage that would take years to repair, and everyone understood that this had only been the beginning of what the Voron Empire was truly capable of unleashing. I found Mia sitting alone near the edge of the tarmac, staring up at a sky finally empty of enemy ships, her flight suit torn at the shoulder from a close call she had not yet told me about. I sat down beside her without speaking, both of us too exhausted for words for a long moment. "We're still here," she finally said, her voice quiet, almost disbelieving. "For now," I answered, watching the stars slowly emerge as the smoke began to clear. Commander Grant found us there sometime later, along with Noah and Grace, the four of us forming an unlikely group united by a single impossible day of survival. Grant carried a datapad displaying preliminary reports from Coalition Command, numbers that told the story of the battle in cold, clinical terms. 211 Voran ships had engaged Earth's defenses, 43 had been destroyed, dozens more had suffered damage severe enough to require withdrawal for repairs. It was not victory, but it was proof, undeniable and impossible to dismiss, that Earth was not the easy conquest the Voran Empire had expected when they first set their sights on designation 742. We had bled, badly, in ways that would take generations to fully heal. But we had made them bleed too, and in the process, we had earned something that mattered more than any single battle. We had earned their attention, not as an afterthought to be conquered at their convenience, but as a genuine threat requiring genuine strategy. And somewhere far above us, in ships retreating to lick their wounds and reconsider their approach, Voran commanders were beginning a conversation that would echo far beyond their own fleet, out into the wider galaxy where other species, other empires, and other cautious observers had already begun watching the small blue planet that refused, against every expectation, to fall. Grace looked up from her datapad, her expression caught somewhere between exhaustion and something that almost resembled hope. "They'll come back," she said, probably angrier, probably smarter about how they approach us. But we bought ourselves time. Time to build, time to prepare, and time to figure out exactly how far we can push this. I did not know, sitting on that tarmac with people who had become something closer to family than colleagues in the span of a few impossible weeks, just how far that push would eventually take us. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep into my bones, that whatever the Voran Empire threw at us next, we would meet it the same way we had met everything since that first terrible morning. Not with perfect strategy or superior technology, but with a refusal to accept the ending they had already written for us, long before they ever knew our name. 2 weeks after the great battle over the Pacific, I stood in a briefing room that had grown far more crowded than the small gathering of 40 pilots I remembered from those early days. Coalition Command had expanded rapidly, pulling in scientists, translators, and strategists from every corner of the globe, all of us packed into a reinforced bunker beneath what remained of a research facility outside Geneva. Grace Turner stood at the front of the room, and for the first time since I had met her, she looked genuinely uncertain about what she was about to say. "We've received a transmission," she began, "that did not originate from Voran Command." The room fell silent in a way that felt different from the usual tense quiet of a war briefing. This was something new, something none of us had prepared for. Grace played the recording, and a voice filled the room, translated through software that stumbled slightly over unfamiliar syntax but conveyed the meaning clearly enough. The voice belonged to a species called the Ithral, a name none of us had heard before that moment. The Ithral, Grace explained once the recording finished, were a smaller interstellar civilization that had existed on the edges of Voran territory for nearly a century, watching the Empire expand world by world, never resisting directly because resistance had always seemed impossible against a force so overwhelming. They had detected the battles around Earth through long-range sensor arrays positioned throughout the sector, and what they had witnessed had prompted them to reach out, cautiously, through a communication channel they insisted was untraceable by Voran monitoring systems. "They're not offering help," Grace clarified quickly, before hope could spread too far through the room. "Not military support, not technology, nothing that direct. But they're offering something almost as valuable: information." The Ithral transmission contained data on Voran fleet compositions, historical conquest patterns, and most importantly, details about the internal political structure of the Empire that had never before been shared with any conquered species. According to the Ithral, the Voran Empire was not the unified, unstoppable force it appeared to be from the outside. It was held together by a rigid hierarchy of regional commanders, each competing for favor and resources from a distant central authority, an authority that demanded results and had little patience for prolonged campaigns against any single world. I sat with that information for a long moment, turning it over in my mind. The Voran commander leading the assault on Earth was not simply fighting a war against us. He was fighting a war against time, against the expectations of superiors who had likely never anticipated a campaign lasting more than a few days. Every week we survived was not just a victory for Earth, it was a mounting failure for the individual commander, tasked with our conquest. A failure that would not go unnoticed by an empire built on ruthless efficiency. "This changes things," Commander Grant said, breaking the silence that had settled over the room. "If we can drag this out, make every engagement costly enough, we're not just fighting for survival anymore, we're putting pressure on someone who has just as much to lose from this war as we do." The Ithral transmission was only the beginning. Over the following days, similar signals began arriving from other sources scattered throughout the sector, each one cautious, each one carefully distanced from any direct involvement, but each one providing pieces of information that Earth's defense could never have gathered on its own. A species called the Doran, communicating through a compressed data burst that took Noah's team nearly 2 full days to properly decode, provided detailed schematics of Voran shield technology, gathered from decades of quiet observation. Noah practically vibrated with excitement when he brought the data to my attention, spreading printouts across a table in the engineering bay, with the enthusiasm of someone who had just been handed the answer to a puzzle he had been struggling with for weeks. Their shields have a resonance frequency, he explained, pointing at a diagram covered in notations only he seemed to fully understand. If we can hit multiple points simultaneously with matched frequencies, we can create feedback loops that overload the shield generators from the inside. This is huge, Ethan. This is actually huge. I did not fully understand the technical details, but I understood the result well enough. Every piece of intelligence arriving from these distant, cautious observers was chipping away at the advantages the Voran had once held over us, closing gaps that would have taken us years to close through our own research and observation alone. It raised a question that none of us could quite answer with certainty. Why were these species helping us at all, even in such careful, indirect ways? Grace offered a theory during one of our late-night discussions in the command bunker, the two of us reviewing incoming data long after most of the base had gone quiet for the night. "They're not doing it out of kindness," she said, her eyes tired but focused as she scrolled through another batch of intercepted communications. "They're doing it because we're the first real test the Voran Empire has faced in generations. If we win, or even survive long enough to make this costly, it proves the Empire isn't as invincible as everyone assumed. That changes the calculations for every species living under their shadow." It was a sobering thought, understanding that our survival had become something larger than ourselves, a symbol that other civilizations were watching from a careful distance, waiting to see if the small, stubborn planet at the edge of Voran expansion could actually hold its ground. We were not just fighting for Earth anymore. We had become, without ever choosing the role, a test case for an entire section of the galaxy wondering if resistance against the Voran Empire was possible at all. The pressure of that realization settled differently on different people. For Grace, it seemed to sharpen her focus, driving her to work longer hours, cross-referencing every piece of incoming intelligence with an intensity that worried me more than it reassured me. For Noah, it fueled an almost manic creativity, prototype after prototype emerging from his engineering bay, as he raced to turn theoretical data into practical weapons, before the Voran launched their next major assault. For me, it was different. I felt the weight of it most acutely during quiet moments, staring up at a night sky that no longer felt like the same sky I had grown up under. Somewhere out there, species I had never heard of, civilizations with histories stretching back further than human civilization itself, were watching what happened on Earth with an interest that felt almost impossible to comprehend. We were not just a planet fighting for survival. We were a signal fire, visible across a vast stretch of the galaxy, and everyone was waiting to see if that fire would burn out or continue to grow. Mia found me one evening, sitting outside the bunker entrance, staring up at that same unfamiliar sky, and she sat down beside me without a word for a long moment before finally speaking. "You've been quiet," she said. "Just thinking," I admitted, "about how big this actually is. It's not just us anymore. It never really was, I guess. We just didn't know it." She was quiet for a moment, considering that. "Does it change anything, knowing other people are watching?" I thought about the question seriously before answering. "I don't think so, not really. We were always going to fight this the same way, whether anyone was watching or not. Maybe it just means the fight matters more than we realized." She nodded slowly, and we sat together in silence for a while longer, both of us processing the strange new scale of the war we had found ourselves fighting. It was easy, in the chaos of daily survival, to forget that Earth existed within a much larger universe, one that had continued turning long before the Voran ever set their sights on our small corner of it. But that larger universe had noticed us now, and there was no going back to the comfortable ignorance of not knowing we were being watched. 3 days later, the practical value of these distant alliances became undeniably clear. Acting on intelligence provided by the Ithral regarding a vulnerability in Voran supply lines, a coordinated coalition strike team launched a daring raid against a resupply convoy positioned just beyond the orbit of Mars, far outside the range most human forces had previously dared to operate. I was not part of that mission, but I listened to the mission reports afterward with a growing sense of disbelief at what we had managed to accomplish. The strike team, flying modified fighters equipped with Noah's shield disruption technology, destroyed 3 supply ships and captured a 4th largely intact, along with its cargo of advanced weapon components and, more importantly, several crew members who would later provide invaluable intelligence about Voran military operations. It was the first time Earth forces had taken the offensive beyond our own atmosphere, and the success of that mission sent a message that traveled far beyond the immediate tactical victory. We were no longer simply defending our world. We had begun, carefully and deliberately, to strike back. That night, another transmission arrived, this one different from the cautious, distant signals we had received before. It came from a species calling themselves the Kasari, and unlike previous contacts, this one contained not just information, but a direct offer. Limited technological support, delivered through indirect channels to avoid drawing Voran attention, in exchange for continued resistance that would keep pressure on an empire the Kasari had apparently been trying to weaken for generations. Grace read the transmission twice, before looking up at the gathered command staff, her expression a careful mixture of caution and something that looked, for the first time in weeks, genuinely close to hope. "They're not just watching anymore," she said. "Some of them are starting to bet on us." I did not know, standing in that crowded briefing room surrounded by exhausted, determined faces, whether that shift would be enough to change the ultimate outcome of the war. But I understood, with absolute clarity, that something fundamental had changed. Earth was no longer alone in the way it had been during those first terrifying days after the invasion began. We had earned, through nothing but stubborn survival and creative resistance, a place in a much larger galactic conversation, one where civilizations far older and far more advanced than our own were beginning to wonder if the empire that had never lost a war might have finally met the world that would prove them wrong. The captured Voran crew member changed everything about how we understood the war we were fighting. And I was there, standing at the edge of a secure holding facility beneath the Geneva bunker, when the interrogation team first managed to establish meaningful communication using a translation device built from technology recovered during the Mars supply raid. The prisoner, a lower-ranking officer whose name translated roughly to a series of clicks and tones, our software rendered simply as Vex, seemed almost as disoriented by captivity as we were by the strangeness of speaking directly with an enemy for the first time. I was not part of the official interrogation team, but Grace had asked me to observe, believing that direct combat experience might help identify inconsistencies or useful details that trained interrogators without battlefield knowledge might overlook. I sat quietly in the corner of the room, watching as Vex answered questions with a strange mixture of resignation and what almost seemed like relief, as though captivity offered an escape from pressures we did not yet fully understand. The commander overseeing this campaign, Vex explained through the halting translation, was not given this assignment as an honor. He was given it as a test, and tests that fail are not forgiven within our hierarchy. This confirmed what the Ithral had suggested weeks earlier, but hearing it directly from a Voran prisoner gave the information a weight it had not carried before. The commander leading the invasion of Earth, a figure we had only known through the cold efficiency of his fleet movements, was fighting not just against us, but against the looming threat of failure within his own command structure. Every week the campaign dragged on without a decisive victory chipped away at his standing, and Vex confirmed that within Voran military culture, prolonged failure often resulted in consequences far more severe than simple demotion. "He grows more desperate," Vex said, and something in the translated tone carried what almost sounded like satisfaction. "Desperate commanders make mistakes." This intelligence reshaped our entire strategic approach over the following weeks. Rather than focusing purely on defensive tactics, Grace and Commander Grant began developing a strategy built around psychological pressure, designed to exploit the growing desperation within Voran command. Every raid, every successful ambush, every piece of captured technology was not just a tactical victory. It was a message aimed directly at a commander whose career and possibly his life depended on results he was struggling to produce. Noah's engineering team, meanwhile, had begun making breakthroughs that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Working from the captured supply ship's cargo and the shield disruption theories provided by the Doran, his team successfully developed a functional prototype weapon, capable of punching through Voran defensive systems, with far greater efficiency than anything we had fielded before. He called it, with characteristic lack of ceremony, the Piercer. And the first successful test firing brought half the engineering bay running to witness the results. I watched the test from a safe distance, standing beside Mia as a modified fighter equipped with the Piercer system, fired on a section of recovered Voran hull plating that had survived every previous weapon we tried against it. The plating did not simply take damage, it shattered, the shield resonance technology causing a cascading failure that spread across the entire section in seconds, leaving behind nothing but scorched, twisted metal. "That's not just a win," Noah said, practically breathless with excitement as he reviewed the sensor data. "That's a game changer. If we can mount this on enough fighters before their next major assault, we're not looking at a defensive stand anymore. We're looking at a real fight." The following weeks became a blur of preparation. Every available resource across the global defense coalition dedicated to retrofitting fighters with the new weapon system, while maintaining enough combat readiness to respond to the smaller skirmishes that continued sporadically across the globe. I found myself splitting time between active patrol duty and training sessions designed to help pilots adjust to the new technology, the Piercer requiring a different firing pattern and targeting approach than the conventional weapons we had trained with before the invasion began. During one of these training sessions, I met Chloe Marsh, a young pilot who had transferred from a regional coalition base after distinguishing herself during a skirmish over what remained of the city of Marseille. She was younger than most of the pilots at Peterson Base, barely 19, but she carried herself with a confidence that reminded me of Mia during those first chaotic weeks of the war. "They say you flew in the Pacific battle," she said, approaching me after one of our training runs, her flight suit still damp with sweat from the exercise. "The big one, 200 ships." 211, I corrected, though I was not sure why the specific number mattered to me. Maybe it was easier to hold on to numbers than to hold on to everything else that day had cost us. "Any advice?" she asked, and there was something genuine in the question, an honesty that cut through the usual bravado I had grown accustomed to hearing from newer pilots eager to prove themselves. I thought about the question seriously before answering. Don't trust the tactical computer completely. It's good, it's useful, but it thinks in patterns. And patterns are exactly what the enemy expects. Trust your instincts. They got us this far. She nodded slowly, taking the advice with more seriousness than I expected from someone her age, and I found myself hoping, with an intensity that surprised me, that she would survive long enough for that advice to matter. The war had taught me, in the months since it began, that hope was a strange and complicated thing to carry, coexisting uncomfortably alongside the constant awareness of how quickly everything could be lost. Grace's psychological pressure strategy began showing results sooner than any of us expected. Coalition forces launched a series of carefully coordinated raids against smaller Voran outposts and supply lines scattered throughout the solar system, each mission designed not just for tactical gain, but to demonstrate a growing capability that would be impossible for Voran Command to ignore. I participated in 3 of these raids over the following month, each one teaching me something new about the strange, evolving rhythm of this war. The most significant of these missions targeted a Voran communication relay station, positioned in a stable orbit beyond the asteroid belt, a facility that served as a critical link between the invasion fleet and the distant Voran homeworld. Destroying it would not end the war, but it would force the invasion commander to rely on slower, less reliable communication methods, further isolating him from the support and guidance his superiors might otherwise provide. The mission required a level of coordination Earth forces had never before attempted. 6 squadrons launching simultaneously from bases across 3 continents, converging on a single target deep in space with a precision that would have seemed impossible during those first chaotic weeks of the war. I flew as part of the escort formation, tasked with protecting the specialized strike team responsible for planting the explosive charges that would ultimately destroy the relay station. The battle that erupted around that station tested everything we had learned since the war began. Voran defensive forces, alerted to our approach far earlier than we had hoped, scrambled a significant defensive fleet that outnumbered our attacking force nearly 3-1. For a long, terrifying stretch of time, it seemed as though the mission would end in catastrophic failure, our forces scattered and overwhelmed by a defensive response we had not fully anticipated. It was Chloe, flying her first major offensive mission, who turned the tide in a moment that would later be discussed and studied by coalition strategists for months afterward. Recognizing that the Voran defensive formation had left a narrow gap in their coverage while repositioning to counter our main assault, she broke from her assigned position without waiting for approval from command, threading her fighter through a corridor of enemy fire that any tactical computer would have calculated as impossible to survive. Her unauthorized maneuver created exactly the opening our strike team needed, and within minutes, the charges were planted, and the relay station erupted into a silent, brilliant explosion that lit up the darkness of space around us. We lost 11 pilots in that battle, a cost that weighed heavily on everyone involved, but the mission succeeded, and the psychological impact on Voran Command, according to intelligence gathered afterward, was significant. Vex, still held in careful captivity back at Geneva, confirmed as much when questioned about the relay station's destruction. "The commander is no longer simply managing a difficult campaign," he explained through the translation device, his tone carrying something that almost resembled grim amusement. "He is now managing a campaign that his superiors believe he cannot control. That is a very different and very dangerous position to be in." This intelligence sparked a new phase of debate within Coalition Command, one I was present for during a late-night strategy session that stretched well past midnight in the Geneva bunker. Grace argued forcefully for continuing the pressure campaign, believing that a commander backed into a corner by his own superiors would eventually be forced into overextending his forces, creating opportunities Earth could exploit. Commander Grant, more cautious by nature, worried that a desperate commander might instead resort to increasingly brutal tactics, abandoning any pretense of preserving Earth's resources in favor of simply ending the campaign by any means necessary. Both perspectives, I would learn in the weeks that followed, contained uncomfortable truths. The Voran response to the relay station's destruction came faster than anyone anticipated, and it did not take the form either Grace or Grant had fully predicted. Rather than a single overwhelming assault or a careful, calculated adjustment of tactics, the Voran commander launched a series of smaller, more aggressive strikes across multiple continents simultaneously, targeting not military installations, but civilian infrastructure, power grids, water treatment facilities, and communication networks that ordinary people across the world depended on for survival. It was, I understood watching the reports come in from cities across the globe, an attempt to break the will of the population directly, bypassing the military resistance that had proven far more effective than anticipated, and instead targeting the fragile systems that kept ordinary human life functioning during an already devastating war. Millions of people across multiple continents lost access to clean water, electricity, and communication, within the span of a single coordinated assault, a humanitarian crisis unfolding alongside the military conflict that had already claimed so much. I remember standing in the command center, watching casualty reports and infrastructure damage assessments scroll across screens faster than anyone could properly process, and feeling a cold, sharp anger settle into my chest, different from anything I had felt during the direct combat of previous battles. This was not a battle between soldiers, this was an attack on people who had no way to fight back, families and children who had done nothing except exist in cities that happened to house the infrastructure the Voran commander had decided to target. Grace's voice, when she finally spoke during the emergency briefing that followed, carried a hardness I had not heard from her before. "This changes the calculation," she said. "He's not just trying to win this war anymore. He's trying to win it fast, whatever the cost, because slow and careful has already failed him." Commander Grant nodded slowly, his expression grim, "Which means our next moves need to account for a commander with nothing left to lose. That makes him more dangerous, not less." I left that briefing with a clarity I had not possessed before, understanding that the war had entered a new and more brutal phase, one where the careful rules of engagement both sides had somehow maintained through months of conflict were beginning to erode. The Voran Empire had come to Earth expecting an easy conquest. Instead, they had found a resistance capable of embarrassing their commander in front of his own superiors, and that embarrassment, we were learning with painful clarity, came with a cost measured in civilian lives. That night, I found Chloe sitting alone near the hangar entrance, staring at nothing in particular, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the relay station mission earlier that day. I sat down beside her, understanding without needing to ask that the weight of everything happening, both the victory in space and the tragedy unfolding across the planet below, had finally caught up with her. "Is it always like this?" she asked quietly, not looking at me. "Winning one thing and losing another at the same time?" I thought about the question for a long moment, thinking about Denver, about the Pacific battle, about the relay station and the cities now suffering because of that success. "I think that's just what war is," I finally said. "Every victory costs something. You just have to decide if it's worth the cost, and keep going even when you're not sure it was." She was quiet for a while after that, and I did not push her to speak further. Somewhere above us, in the darkness of space, a desperate commander was recalculating his strategy, and somewhere across a world already scarred by months of conflict, ordinary people were struggling through a crisis born from our own success on the battlefield. The war had grown larger and more complicated than any of us had anticipated when it began, and I understood, sitting there in the cool night air, that the hardest choices were still ahead of us. The message reached me 3 days after the infrastructure attacks began, delivered by a coalition liaison officer whose face told me the news before he said a single word. My parents had been living in a small town outside Portland, far enough from any major military target that we had all believed, foolishly, that they were safe from the worst of the war. The Voran strike on the regional power grid had caused a cascading failure at the hospital where my mother had been recovering from a minor surgery, and the backup generators, overwhelmed by the scale of the citywide outage, had failed within hours. I do not remember much of what the officer said after that. I remember sitting down hard on a bench outside the briefing room, the world narrowing to a single point of unbearable stillness, and I remember Mia finding me there sometime later, though I could not have said how much time had passed. She did not say anything comforting, because there was nothing comforting to say. She simply sat beside me, her presence a quiet anchor, in a moment when everything else felt like it was drifting away. My father survived, though he would tell me later, During a brief and difficult phone call that took days to arrange through the strained communication networks still recovering from the attack, that survival had never felt more hollow. I flew a mission 2 days after receiving that news, against Grant's recommendation and against my own better judgment, because staying still felt somehow worse than the risk of combat. It was not a decision born from courage, it was a decision born from a grief that had nowhere else to go. That mission changed something in me that I would spend months trying to understand. We engaged a small Voran patrol near the edge of what remained of a coastal defense line, a routine skirmish that should have posed no unusual difficulty given everything we had learned and developed over the preceding months. But I found myself fighting with a recklessness that alarmed even Mia, pushing my fighter into maneuvers that prioritized damage over survival, chasing enemy ships with an intensity that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the anger I had not yet found any other way to release. I destroyed 3 enemy fighters that day, more than I had ever managed in a single engagement, but the victory felt distant and unsatisfying, like trying to fill a hole with something that could never actually match its shape. When I finally landed back at base, Grant pulled me aside, and the conversation that followed was not the reprimand I expected. "I lost my brother in the first week of this war," he told me, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of the usual command authority that colored every other conversation I had shared with him. "I know what you're carrying right now. I know how tempting it is to try to burn it away by fighting harder, taking bigger risks. But that anger, if you let it drive you completely, it doesn't make you a better pilot. It makes you a pilot who eventually gets themselves and everyone flying beside them killed." I did not want to hear it in that moment, though I understood, even through the fog of grief, that he was right. Over the following weeks, I struggled with a version of myself I did not fully recognize, someone caught between the disciplined pilot I had trained to become and the grieving son who wanted nothing more than to make the enemy responsible for his mother's death pay for what they had taken. Mia became, during that difficult stretch, something closer to family than I had realized I needed. She did not try to fix my grief or rush me through it. She simply stayed present, flying beside me during missions, sitting with me during the quiet moments, when the weight of everything threatened to become too much to carry alone. I began to understand, watching how she carried her own losses from the war with a steadiness I envied, that grief and duty could coexist without one destroying the other, though finding that balance felt like the hardest thing I had ever attempted. The infrastructure attacks continued sporadically over the following 2 weeks, though never again with the same devastating scale as that first coordinated strike. Coalition forces adapted quickly, distributing power generation and water treatment across more resilient, decentralized systems that proved far harder for the Voran to disrupt effectively. It was a small but meaningful victory, one that came too late for my mother and for thousands of others across the world who had lost their lives in those first chaotic days of the new strategy, but a victory nonetheless. Proof that human adaptability extended beyond the battlefield into every corner of the struggle for survival. Vex, still held in careful captivity, provided additional insight during this period that helped explain the shifting tactics we were facing. The commander leading the invasion, according to information filtering through increasingly limited channels between the prisoner and his former chain of command, had received a formal reprimand from Voran Central Authority, following the failure of the infrastructure campaign to produce the swift surrender he had promised. It was, Vex explained with something that had grown into genuine satisfaction over his weeks of captivity, a significant blow to a commander already struggling to justify the prolonged campaign to his superiors. "He will not risk another failure of this scale," Vex predicted during one of the interrogation sessions I observed, "which means his next move will likely be smaller, more calculated, an attempt to secure a decisive advantage without the risk of another public embarrassment." Grace took this prediction seriously, and coalition strategy shifted accordingly, focusing on identifying and reinforcing the specific vulnerabilities a cautious, calculating commander might target next. But even as the strategic conversations continued around me, I found myself struggling with a different kind of battle, one that had nothing to do with tactics or fleet movements. I attended a memorial service, held in the ruins of what had once been the hospital where my mother died, alongside dozens of other families who had lost loved ones during the infrastructure attacks. Standing among strangers who shared an unbearable, specific kind of grief, I understood something I had not fully grasped before. Even through months of combat and loss, this war was not an abstract struggle for survival, playing out on some distant battlefield. It was a wound that had cut into every single community across the entire planet, leaving behind a version of grief so widespread that it had become, in its own terrible way, another thing that united us. My father spoke briefly during the service, his voice steady despite everything, and something he said stayed with me long after the ceremony ended. "They wanted to break us," he said, looking out at the gathered crowd of grieving families. "They thought taking everything from us would make us give up. But grief, When you share it with enough people, it doesn't just break you. Sometimes, it becomes something else entirely. I did not fully understand what he meant in that moment, but I would come to understand it in the weeks and months that followed, as the shared weight of loss across the entire coalition transformed slowly into a resolve that felt different from the desperate, chaotic determination of those early days after the invasion began. We were no longer simply fighting to survive. We were fighting because too many people had already been lost for the fight to stop now, because giving up would mean that every sacrifice made so far had counted for nothing. I returned to active duty 2 weeks after my mother's death, not because the grief had faded, but because I had finally found a way to carry it that did not threaten to consume everything else. Grant noticed the change immediately, watching me during a training exercise with an expression that suggested careful, cautious approval. "You're flying differently," he observed afterward, as we stood together on the tarmac watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that had once felt beautiful before the war. Taught me to associate every dramatic sky with the memory of burning cities. "I'm not trying to burn it away anymore," I told him, understanding the truth of the words even as I spoke them for the first time. "I'm just trying to make sure it means something." He nodded slowly, seeming to understand exactly what I meant, and we stood together in silence for a while longer, two people shaped by loss into something neither of us had expected to become, watching a sky that had once felt safe and now felt like a constant reminder of everything the war had cost us, and everything it might still take before it finally, one way or another, came to an end. 6 months into the war, a ship arrived in our solar system that did not belong to the Voran Empire, and its appearance sent every coalition base across the globe into a state of alert unlike anything we had experienced since the initial invasion. I was in the middle of a routine patrol when the alert came through, my fighter banking sharply as I redirected toward the coordinates Coalition Command had flagged, my heart pounding with an uncertainty that felt different from the familiar fear of Voran combat. The ship, when I finally caught sight of it through my cockpit display, looked nothing like anything the Voran had ever fielded. Its hull was pale silver rather than black, curved in smooth, organic lines that seemed almost beautiful compared to the sharp, predatory angles of Voran design. It hung motionless just beyond the orbit of Mars, broadcasting a signal on a frequency Noah's team quickly identified as compatible with the translation protocols we had developed from our captured Voran technology. Grace Turner led the response team that first made contact, and I was assigned to the escort squadron providing protection during the tense hours of initial communication. The species aboard the ship identified themselves as the Kasari, the same civilization that had offered limited technological support through indirect channels months earlier. This time, they had come directly, no longer content to hide behind cautious, distance transmissions. I listened to the initial exchange through the Coalition communication network, my fighter holding formation at a respectful distance from the alien vessel, while Grace and a small delegation of Coalition officials conducted the first face-to-face contact humanity had ever had with an extraterrestrial civilization that was not actively trying to destroy us. The Kasari representative, whose voice carried a musical quality even through the imperfect translation software, explained that they had watched Earth's resistance with growing interest and had finally decided that the risk of direct contact was worth taking. "Your survival has proven something we long believed impossible," the representative explained, according to the transcript I reviewed later that evening back at base, that the Voran Empire is not, as they have claimed for generations, an unstoppable force of nature. "This proof has value beyond your own world. We are prepared to offer meaningful support, not simply information, but resources, in exchange for your continued resistance." The offer, when it was fully detailed during subsequent negotiations, exceeded anything Coalition Command had dared to hope for. The Kasari possessed advanced manufacturing technology capable of producing weapons and shielding systems far beyond what Noah's team had managed to reverse engineer from captured Voran equipment. They offered to share this technology, along with a limited number of trained advisors who could help accelerate Earth's military development, though they were careful to emphasize that direct military intervention remained off the table, a risk their own civilization was not prepared to take, given the potential consequences of open conflict with the Voran Empire. I understood their caution even as it frustrated me. The Kasari had watched other civilizations fall to Voran conquest for generations, and their reluctance to risk direct confrontation was born from a fear I could not fully blame them for holding. But even their limited support represented a turning point in the war, transforming Earth from an isolated world fighting alone against impossible odds into a planet with genuine, if cautious, allies among the stars. Noah's reaction to the technology transfer that followed over the subsequent weeks bordered on something close to religious wonder. I found him one evening in the engineering bay, surrounded by Kasari advisors and stacks of technical schematics that represented decades of advanced research, suddenly made available to Earth's struggling defense industry. His eyes carried the particular brightness of someone witnessing possibilities he had only dreamed about in his most ambitious theoretical work. They're centuries ahead of us in shield technology, he told me, barely looking up from the schematics spread across his workstation. Centuries, Ethan. What would have taken us decades to develop on our own, we might manage in months with their help. The Kasari Advisors, a small delegation of 6 individuals whose physical appearance combined features that reminded me distantly of both marine life and something more insectoid, proved surprisingly patient teachers despite the significant communication barriers that remained even with translation technology. I spent time observing several of their training sessions with coalition engineering teams, watching as concepts that had seemed like science fiction only months earlier slowly transformed into practical, achievable technology. Not everyone within Coalition Command greeted the Kasari Alliance with unreserved enthusiasm. During a tense strategy session I attended alongside Grace and Commander Grant, several military leaders raised concerns about becoming dependent on external support that could be withdrawn at any moment, leaving Earth vulnerable if the Kasari decided the political risk of continued involvement had grown too great. They're not doing this out of friendship, one general argued, his skepticism evident in every word. They're doing this because it serves their own strategic interests. We need to remember that. And we need to make sure we're not building our entire defense strategy around support that could disappear the moment it becomes inconvenient for them. Grace acknowledged the concern without dismissing the value of the alliance itself. He's right that we can't depend entirely on outside help, she said. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't use every advantage available to us right now. We accelerate our own development using their technology as a foundation. And we make sure that even if their support ends tomorrow, we're better positioned than we were yesterday. It was a pragmatic approach that came to define coalition strategy over the following months, embracing Kasari assistance while simultaneously investing heavily in independent research and development that would not leave Earth vulnerable to a sudden withdrawal of external support. The balance proved difficult to maintain, but the results spoke for themselves, as coalition forces began fielding technology that would have seemed impossible just half a year earlier. I received a significant upgrade to my own fighter during this period, incorporating Kasari shield technology that Noah's team had successfully adapted to human piloting systems within just 6 weeks of the initial technology transfer. The first time I took the upgraded fighter into combat, engaging a small Voran scouting patrol near the edge of our expanded defensive perimeter, the difference felt almost surreal. Enemy fire that would have previously forced evasive maneuvers now simply dissipated against shields that had never existed in any human military application before that moment. The psychological impact of this technological leap extended beyond the battlefield itself. Vex, still held in careful captivity and increasingly cooperative as months of consistent, respectful treatment had gradually eroded whatever loyalty he had once held toward Voran Command, expressed genuine surprise when informed of the Kasari Alliance during one of our regular debriefing sessions. The Kasari have avoided direct involvement in Voran conflicts for as long as our records exist, he explained through the translation device, his tone carrying something that sounded almost like respect, an emotion I had not expected to hear directed toward humanity from a former enemy. For them to risk open support, even in this limited form, suggests they believe your survival represents something significant. This will not go unnoticed by Voran Command, and it will not be received calmly. His prediction proved accurate within weeks. Voran fleet movements throughout the outer solar system increased noticeably, coalition sensors detecting new patrol patterns that suggested growing concern about potential Kasari involvement extending beyond the technology transfer already completed. It created a tense, uncertain period where every coalition mission carried the added weight of potentially provoking a Voran response, aimed not just at Earth, but at discouraging any further outside support from reaching us. During this tense period, I found myself reflecting often on how dramatically the scope of this war had expanded since those first chaotic days after the initial invasion. What had begun as a desperate defense of a single, isolated planet had transformed into something far larger, a conflict that now involved the careful political calculations of civilizations scattered across a significant stretch of the galaxy, each one watching to see how the balance of power might shift depending on the outcome of humanity's continued resistance. Mia and I discussed this shifting scale one evening, sitting together on the edge of the base perimeter, watching the stars with a newfound awareness that some of those distant points of light represented civilizations who now had a genuine stake in whether we lived or died. It's strange, she said, knowing we're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. Every battle we win or lose, it echoes out there somewhere, to people we'll probably never meet. Does that make it feel bigger or smaller? I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective after everything we had witnessed together. She considered the question carefully before answering. Bigger, I think. But also, somehow, less lonely. We're not just some forgotten planet fighting a hopeless war anymore. We matter to people beyond our own world. That has to count for something. I found comfort in her words, even as the practical realities of the war continued to demand every ounce of focus and resilience we could muster. The Kasari alliance, imperfect and cautious as it remained, had fundamentally altered the trajectory of our resistance, providing tools and knowledge that accelerated our development in ways that might otherwise have taken generations to achieve independently. 3 weeks after the technology transfer began in earnest, coalition forces successfully repelled a significant Voran assault against our expanded defensive perimeter near Mars, the newly upgraded shields and weapon systems performing beyond even Noah's optimistic projections. We lost far fewer pilots than similar engagements earlier in the war, and the Voran fleet, encountering resistance far more capable than their previous intelligence had suggested, withdrew with visible caution, rather than pressing an assault that had clearly exceeded their expectations. Vex, when informed of the battle's outcome, offered a final observation that stayed with me long after our conversation ended. The commander now faces a war he cannot win through conventional means, he said, his translated voice carrying a strange, complicated mixture of resignation and something that almost resembled sympathy for an enemy he had once served, which means his next decisions will likely become far more unpredictable and far more dangerous than anything you have faced from him so far. I did not know, standing in that debriefing room with the weight of his warning settling over me, exactly what form that unpredictable danger would eventually take, but I understood, with a clarity that had become familiar over these long months of war, that whatever came next would test everything we had built, every alliance we had earned, and every ounce of resilience that had carried us this far against odds that had once seemed impossible to overcome. The intelligence arrived through Vex during what had become a routine debriefing session, though nothing about what he told us that day felt routine at all. The Voran commander, backed into a corner by months of mounting failures and increasingly hostile communications from his distant superiors, had made a decision that Vex described as both predictable and deeply alarming. He intended to relocate his primary command ship, the massive vessel serving as the nerve center for the entire invasion fleet, into a fixed defensive position within Earth's own orbital space, close enough to launch a final, overwhelming assault, while remaining protected by the bulk of his remaining fleet. He believes this will end the war quickly, Vex explained, his translated voice carrying a weight that suggested he understood better than any of us, the desperation driving this decision. A commander with nothing left to lose will often choose the boldest option available, believing total victory is the only outcome that can salvage his position. Grace convened an emergency strategy session within hours of receiving this information, and I found myself seated at a table crowded with coalition leadership, Kasari advisors, and engineering specialists, all of us grappling with the reality that the war might be approaching its final, decisive confrontation. Commander Grant laid out the tactical situation with a gravity that silenced the usual background murmur of a crowded briefing room. If their command ship enters a fixed orbital position, it becomes vulnerable in a way it has never been before, he explained, gesturing toward a holographic display projected by Kasari technology, showing the massive vessel's projected defensive capabilities. But it also means every remaining Voran ship in this system will be concentrated around a single point, defending that vessel with everything they have left. This isn't a raid, this is the final battle of this war, one way or another. The plan that emerged over the following 48 hours of intense strategic planning represented the culmination of everything Earth had learned and developed since that first terrible morning when black ships appeared above our cities. Noah's engineering teams, working alongside Kasari advisors, had completed development of an advanced version of the Piercer weapon system, now capable of punching through even the reinforced shielding protecting the Voran command ship itself. Grace's understanding of Voran command structure and psychology, refined through months of careful intelligence gathering, informed a strategy built around disruption and misdirection, rather than simple overwhelming force. I was assigned to the primary strike squadron, tasked with escorting a small group of specialized fighters carrying the upgraded Piercer weapons directly toward the command ship itself, while the majority of coalition forces engaged the surrounding Voran fleet in a massive diversionary battle, designed to draw attention and resources away from our true objective. Mia would fly beside me, along with Chloe, whose skill and instincts had earned her a position among the most experienced pilots in the coalition despite her relative youth. The night before the assault, I found myself unable to sleep, sitting outside the barracks and staring up at a sky that held, somewhere beyond my sight, the ship that would determine the fate of everything we had fought for over the preceding months. Mia joined me there, as she had so many times before during this long war, and we sat together in a silence that had grown comfortable through shared experience. "You scared?" she asked eventually, breaking the quiet. "Terrified," I admitted honestly. "You?" "Every time," she said. "I think if you stop being scared, that's when you stop being careful enough to survive." I thought about her words for a long moment, watching the stars slowly shift across the sky. "Whatever happens tomorrow," I said, "I'm glad it was you flying beside me through all of this." She smiled, tired but genuine, and reached over to squeeze my hand briefly. Same goes for you, Ethan. Let's make sure tomorrow isn't the last time we get to say that. The assault began at dawn, coalition forces launching from bases across the globe in the largest coordinated offensive Earth had ever attempted. I watched the sun rise through my cockpit canopy as we broke through the atmosphere, joining a formation of fighters stretching further than I could properly see. Every pilot understanding that this battle would likely determine whether humanity continued to exist as a free species or fell under Voran control the way so many worlds before us had already fallen. The Voran command ship came into view as we crossed the threshold of Earth's outer defensive perimeter, and its scale still managed to stagger me despite everything I had witnessed over the preceding months of war. It hung in high orbit like a dark moon, surrounded by the remaining bulk of the invasion fleet, hundreds of fighters and support vessels arranged in a defensive formation that made our previous battles look almost insignificant by comparison. All squadrons, engage as planned. Commander Grant's voice came through the coalition-wide communication network, steady, despite the enormity of what we were about to attempt. Strike team, hold position until the diversion is fully underway. This only works if their attention is exactly where we need it to be. The diversionary assault began exactly on schedule, coalition fighters sweeping toward the outer edge of the Voran defensive formation in a massive, coordinated engagement that immediately drew the attention of the majority of enemy forces. I watched from a distance, holding position with the strike team, as the sky filled with the chaotic light of hundreds of ships locked in combat, the largest battle Earth had ever fought unfolding in the space of just a few minutes. Strike team, you're clear. Grace's voice cut through the comm, her tone carrying the controlled tension of someone watching everything she had worked toward reach its critical moment. Command ship's defensive attention is fully engaged with the main fleet. This is your window. We broke formation and dove toward the command ship, 6 fighters carrying the upgraded piercer weapons, escorted by Mia, myself, and 4 other pilots, tasked with protecting the strike team from any Voran defenders who managed to break away from the main battle in time to intercept us. The command ship grew larger with terrifying speed as we approached, its hull covered in defensive weapon emplacements that began tracking our formation the moment automated systems detected our approach. Incoming point defense fire, Chloe's voice came through the comm, tight with focus rather than fear. Evasive pattern Delta, now. We broke into the scattered, unpredictable formation that had become second nature after months of combat against an enemy that still struggled to fully counter human improvisation, weaving through a field of defensive fire that would have torn a conventional formation apart within seconds. I felt my fighter shudder as a glancing shot clipped my shield, the Kasari technology absorbing damage that would have destroyed my ship entirely just months earlier, and I pushed forward, focusing every ounce of concentration on maintaining formation with the strike team as we closed the remaining distance to the command ship's hull. The first piercer strike hit the ship's primary shield generator, and even from my position, I could see the cascading failure spreading exactly as Noah's calculations had predicted, sections of the massive shield flickering and collapsing in a wave that spread across nearly a third of the vessel's surface. It was working. Against every impossible odd, the strategy we had spent weeks planning was actually working. But the moment of triumph did not last. A significant portion of the Voran defensive fleet, alerted to the true nature of our assault, broke away from the main battle and turned toward the command ship, moving with a speed and coordination that suggested this contingency had been planned for, despite the commander's apparent confidence in his fixed defensive position. Within seconds, our small strike team found itself facing a wave of enemy fighters far more numerous than our escort could hope to handle alone. "We need more time," one of the strike team pilots called out over the comm, his voice tight with strain as he maneuvered to avoid a converging group of enemy fighters. "Second charge isn't set yet." I made a decision in that moment that I would later understand as the most significant choice of the entire war, though it did not feel like a calculated strategic decision at the time. It felt like instinct, the same instinct that had carried me through every battle since that first terrible morning above Denver. I broke from my defensive position and flew directly into the path of the approaching enemy formation, drawing their attention and fire away from the vulnerable strike team still working to complete the second charge placement. "Ethan, what are you doing?" Mia's voice came through the comm, sharp with alarm as she immediately moved to follow my trajectory. "Buying time," I answered, weaving through a storm of enemy fire that felt, for a terrifying moment, like it might finally be more than even Kasari's shielding could absorb. "Get that second charge set, that's all that matters right now." The following minutes blurred together into a chaos of maneuvering and sustained combat that tested every skill I had developed over months of increasingly desperate warfare. Mia flew beside me, matching my reckless trajectory with a skill that had only grown sharper through every battle we had survived together, and between the two of us, we managed to hold the attention of a significant portion of the enemy formation long enough for the strike team to complete their work. "Second charge set," came the call I had been desperately waiting to hear, falling back now. All strike team and escort, disengage and clear the blast radius. Grant's voice cut through the chaos, urgent and clear. Detonation in 30 seconds. I broke away from the enemy formation, Mia beside me, both of us pushing our fighters to their absolute limits as we raced to put sufficient distance between ourselves and the command ship before the charges detonated. Enemy fighters pursued us for a brief, terrifying stretch of seconds before Grant's voice counted down the final moments, and I watched, through my rear display, as the Voran command ship erupted in a cascade of secondary explosions that spread from the initial charge points across the entire vulnerable section of hull the first piercer strike had exposed. The explosion was silent in the vacuum of space, but the visual impact still struck me with a force that felt almost physical. Watching the massive vessel that had commanded the entire invasion fleet since that first terrible morning begin to break apart. Sections of hull tumbling away as internal systems failed in a rapid, catastrophic cascade. It was, without question, the single most significant tactical victory of the entire war, and I felt a surge of something that was not quite triumph, tempered by the ongoing chaos of battle still raging around us. The destruction of the command ship sent immediate, visible shockwaves through the remaining Voran fleet. Coordination that had defined their combat effectiveness throughout the entire war collapsed almost instantly. Ships that had fought with rigid, centralized precision suddenly reduced to independent, uncoordinated units, struggling to adapt to a battlefield that no longer provided the guidance they had always relied upon. Coalition forces, sensing the shift immediately, pressed their advantage with a coordinated intensity that turned the battle decisively in our favor within minutes. I fought through the remainder of that battle in a state that felt almost dreamlike. Adrenaline and exhaustion blending together into a strange, focused clarity that carried me through engagement after engagement without conscious thought. By the time the last significant pocket of Voran resistance finally broke and began a chaotic, disorganized retreat toward the edge of the solar system, I had lost track of how many hours had passed since the battle began, my body running purely on the momentum of survival instinct. Vex, when informed of the command ship's destruction during a debriefing conducted almost immediately after coalition forces confirmed the battle's outcome, offered a reaction that stayed with me long after our conversation ended. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and when he finally spoke, his translated voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before, something that sounded almost like genuine awe. "No world has ever destroyed a Voran command ship," he said. "Not in the entire recorded history of the Empire's expansion. This will not simply be reported as a defeat. This will be reported as proof that the Empire itself can be broken." I sat with those words for a long time after returning to base, my body finally beginning to register the full exhaustion of a battle that had stretched across nearly the entire day. Mia found me in the hangar, both of us still in our flight suits, too tired and too overwhelmed by everything that had happened to fully process the magnitude of what we had accomplished. "We actually did it," she said, her voice carrying a disbelief that mirrored my own feelings exactly. "We destroyed their command ship, Ethan. We actually did it." I looked at her, at the exhaustion and relief and lingering fear all mixed together in her expression, and I understood that this moment, whatever came next in the aftermath of this impossible victory, represented something that would echo far beyond the immediate tactical outcome. We had proven, in the most direct and undeniable way possible, that the Empire which had conquered dozens of worlds without ever facing genuine resistance, had finally, against every expectation, met a world capable of breaking its most fundamental assumptions about its own invincibility. Grant found us both a short while later, his expression carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent an entire day watching the outcome of months of planning hang in the balance. "Command ship's destruction has triggered a full withdrawal," he told us, though something in his tone suggested this was not quite the unambiguous celebration the words might have implied. "Remaining Voran forces are retreating beyond the outer edge of the solar system. For now, the immediate threat to Earth has ended." "For now," I repeated, understanding immediately the careful qualification in his words. "For now," he confirmed. "This war isn't over, Ethan. We just won the most important battle of it. But the Empire that sent this fleet is far larger than what we've faced here. We need to prepare for whatever comes next, because I promise you, this isn't the end. It's just the beginning of a very different kind of war." I understood, standing in that hangar with my closest friends beside me, exhausted from a battle that had tested every limit of human courage and ingenuity, that his words carried an uncomfortable truth I could not afford to ignore. We had won something extraordinary, something that would echo across the galaxy in ways we were only beginning to comprehend. But the war for Earth's survival, and for whatever came after that survival was finally secured, had only just entered its next uncertain chapter. The weeks following the destruction of the Voran command ship brought a strange, unfamiliar quiet to Earth's skies, the kind of silence that felt less like peace and more like the pause before an uncertain next chapter. Coalition sensors tracked the retreating Voron fleet as it withdrew beyond the outer edge of the solar system, gathering at a distance that suggested regrouping rather than complete abandonment of the campaign against us. I spent those weeks split between necessary rest and the constant low-grade tension of not knowing exactly what would come next. Vex proved instrumental during this period, his cooperation deepening as months of captivity had gradually transformed his relationship with humanity from prisoner and captor into something closer to a genuine, if complicated, alliance. Through channels he still maintained some limited access to, he helped Coalition intelligence understand the political earthquake the command ship's destruction had triggered within Voron Imperial structure. The commander responsible for this campaign has been recalled, Vex explained during a debriefing session roughly 3 weeks after the battle, his translated voice carrying information that immediately drew the full attention of everyone in the room. Recalled is a generous translation. In our language, the term carries a much harsher meaning, closer to what your species might call disgraced beyond recovery. His failure here is being discussed throughout the Empire, not simply as a tactical loss, but as proof that the foundational strategy the Voron have used for generations may no longer be reliable. The implications of this news rippled outward through Coalition command, with a significance that took time to fully process. The empire that had expanded across a significant portion of the galaxy through generations of unchallenged conquest was now facing, for the first time in its recorded history, genuine internal questions about whether its methods remained effective against a species willing to fight with the kind of creative, unpredictable resilience Earth had demonstrated throughout this brutal war. Grace called a meeting roughly a month after the battle, gathering Coalition leadership alongside the Kasari advisors who had remained on Earth to continue their technology-sharing partnership. The purpose of the meeting, she explained, was to address something that had begun appearing with increasing frequency in the data streams Coalition sensors continued to monitor throughout the surrounding sectors of space. Other civilizations, emboldened by Earth's demonstrated resistance, had begun making contact, some cautiously, some with an openness that surprised even the most optimistic members of Coalition command. I sat in on several of these initial contact briefings over the following weeks, watching as representatives from civilizations we had never known existed introduced themselves through increasingly sophisticated translation technology, each conversation adding another piece to a picture of the galaxy, far larger and more complex than humanity had ever imagined during our isolated existence before the invasion began. A species called the Meridian, existing in a system roughly 40 light-years distant, offered trade partnerships built around technology exchange. A collective known simply as the Arail Assembly, representing several allied smaller civilizations, expressed interest in establishing formal diplomatic relations, citing Earth's resistance as proof that the long-standing Voron dominance over the region might finally be genuinely challenged. "They're not just watching anymore," Grace observed during one particularly significant briefing, reviewing the growing list of civilizations that had reached out following the command ship's destruction. "They're recalculating everything they thought they understood about power in this part of the galaxy. And we're at the center of that recalculation whether we wanted that position or not." The weight of this new reality settled differently on different members of our team. Noah characteristically threw himself into the technical opportunities this expanded contact represented, working alongside Kasari advisors and now several representatives from the Meridian to accelerate Earth's technological development even further. Driven by an insatiable curiosity about the possibilities this new galactic awareness had opened up, I found him one evening surrounded by schematics from 3 different alien civilizations, his excitement barely contained despite the exhaustion visible in every line of his posture. "We're not just catching up anymore," he told me, gesturing at the overlapping technical diagrams spread across his workstation. "We're starting to contribute things back." The Meridian representative told me our approach to adaptive shielding, the stuff we developed out of pure desperation, it's actually novel to them. We might have something to teach the galaxy, not just learn from it. Mia approached this expanding new reality with more caution, a perspective I found myself increasingly sharing as the weeks passed. During a quiet evening conversation outside the barracks, one of the few moments of genuine calm we had managed to find since the war began, she voiced concerns that had been building in my own mind as well. "Everyone wants something from us now," she said, watching the stars with an expression more thoughtful than fearful. "Trade, alliance, information. It's better than being invaded, obviously. But I keep wondering what happens when all these new relationships start pulling us in different directions. We just fought a war to protect our own choices. I don't want us to lose that just because we survived it." Her concern proved prescient in the weeks that followed, as Coalition Command found itself navigating an increasingly complex web of diplomatic overtures, each civilization approaching Earth with different motivations and different expectations about what a relationship with humanity might ultimately mean. Grace, drawing on skills that had proven invaluable throughout the military conflict, took on an increasingly central role in shaping how Earth would approach this new chapter of galactic engagement, insisting on careful, measured responses that preserved humanity's independence even while building genuine, mutually beneficial partnerships. I participated in one particularly significant diplomatic exchange roughly 2 months after the command ship's destruction, serving as part of a security escort during a formal meeting between coalition leadership and representatives from the Oral Assembly, the collective that had expressed the strongest interest in formal alliance. The meeting took place aboard a Kasari vessel positioned in stable orbit, chosen as neutral ground acceptable to all parties involved. The Orel representatives, 3 individuals whose physical form combined elements that reminded me somewhat distantly of both avian and reptilian characteristics from Earth's own biology, approached the negotiations with a directness that Grace later noted stood in sharp contrast to the more cautious, indirect communication style the Kasari had favored throughout their own relationship with humanity. Your resistance has demonstrated something the Voran Empire has spent generations trying to convince the galaxy was impossible, the lead RL representative explained, through increasingly refined translation software, her tone carrying what I interpreted, perhaps imperfectly given the vast cultural differences involved, as genuine respect. We have watched empires rise and expand unchallenged for longer than your species has existed in its current form. What you have accomplished here matters far beyond the survival of your single world. The negotiations that followed stretched across several days, covering everything from technology sharing agreements to the careful, complex question of what mutual defense might look like should the Voran Empire attempt a second invasion, a possibility that no one in that room treated as anything less than a genuine, ongoing threat, despite the significant victory we had already achieved. I found myself, during quieter moments between formal negotiation sessions, reflecting on how dramatically everything had changed since that first terrifying morning when black ships appeared above Denver. We had gone from a fractured, divided planet unprepared for any kind of interstellar conflict to a unified coalition capable of destroying an enemy command ship and negotiating as equals with civilizations who had existed among the stars for far longer than human history could account for. It was a transformation that felt, even having lived through every difficult step of it, almost impossible to fully comprehend. Vex, informed of the ongoing diplomatic developments during one of our continuing debriefing sessions, offered a perspective that added yet another layer of complexity to everything unfolding around us. The Empire will not simply accept this outcome, he warned, his tone carrying a seriousness that cut through whatever comfort the recent diplomatic successes might have otherwise provided. A second campaign is being discussed, one that will likely commit far greater resources than the first, precisely because the political cost of accepting defeat here has grown too significant to ignore. Your success has created new allies for you, but it has also created new urgency for them. This warning shaped coalition strategies significantly over the following months, as the initial euphoria following the command ship's destruction gradually gave way to a more measured, forward-looking approach to preparation. Grant oversaw a comprehensive restructuring of Earth's defense capabilities, incorporating lessons learned throughout the war alongside the accelerated technological development made possible through our expanding network of alien partnerships. I found myself, during this period of relative calm, punctuated by constant preparation, reflecting often on how much I personally had changed since the war began. The uncertain young reserve pilot who had watched his city burn from an apartment balcony felt like a distant memory, replaced by someone who had fought in some of the most significant battles in human history, someone who had lost family and found new family among the people who had fought beside him, someone who now understood, with a clarity that felt both empowering and deeply humbling, that Earth's story had become inseparably woven into the much larger story of an entire galaxy watching, waiting, and beginning to believe that the empire many had assumed was permanent might finally have met its match. 6 months after the command ship's destruction, coalition intelligence, supported by information from both Vex and our expanding network of alien allies, confirmed what everyone had feared since the initial victory. The Voran Empire was assembling a second invasion fleet, larger than the first, drawing resources from across their vast territory, in a campaign that made clear how seriously they now regarded the threat Earth represented to their continued dominance. Grace called a final strategic briefing before this news would be shared with the broader coalition, and I remember the weight of that room, filled with people who had already sacrificed so much, now facing the reality that their hardest fighting might still lie ahead of them. "They're coming back," she said simply, her voice steady, despite the enormity of what those words represented. "Bigger, angrier, and with everything they have left to throw at us. But we're not the same world they attacked the first time. We have allies now, we have technology we never had before, and we have something they still don't fully understand, no matter how many times we prove it to them." "What's that?" someone asked from within the gathered crowd. Grace's answer, delivered with a quiet certainty that settled over the entire room, would stay with me long after that meeting ended. We have a species that has never known how to accept the ending someone else has already written for us. That's not going to change, no matter how large their next fleet is. I looked around that room, at Mia, at Noah, at Chloe, at Commander Grant, at every face marked by the sacrifices and struggles of the war we had already survived, and I understood that whatever came next, we would face it the same way we had faced everything since that first terrible morning. Together, unpredictable, and utterly unwilling to accept defeat, no matter how impossible the odds arrayed against us might appear. The second Voran fleet arrived 8 months after Grace's warning, and this time, Earth did not meet them unprepared. I stood on the flight deck of a coalition command station, now orbiting alongside a defensive network that had not existed during those first chaotic days of the war, a network built from human ingenuity, combined with technology shared by allies who had, in the months since our first great victory, transformed from cautious observers into genuine partners, invested in Earth's survival. The fleet that emerged from the darkness beyond the outer planets dwarfed anything the Voran had committed to their first invasion attempt. Hundreds upon hundreds of ships stretching across sensor readings that took Noah's analysis team several tense minutes to fully process. I felt the familiar tightness of fear settle into my chest as the reports came through, but underneath that fear, something else had grown steadier over the preceding months of preparation. Not confidence exactly, but something close to it, a hard-earned belief that we had built something capable of meeting this challenge. Commander Grant addressed the assembled coalition forces through a broadcast that reached every pilot, every ground crew member, every person across the entire planet who had contributed to the massive defensive effort now standing ready to face this second, far more dangerous invasion. His voice, when it came through my cockpit comm, carried none of the uncertainty that had colored his words during that first desperate battle so many months earlier. They come back larger, because they underestimated us once and paid for that mistake, he said. They will not underestimate us again. This will be the hardest fight of this entire war, but we are not the same world that stood alone against 6 ships in the skies above Denver. We have allies, we have technology built from our own hands, and the generosity of civilizations who now call us partners. And we have each other, the same resilience that carried us through everything this war has already cost us. Let's show them exactly what that resilience means. Mia flew beside me as we launched into formation, alongside Chloe and dozens of other pilots who had survived and grown through every brutal lesson this war had taught us. Noah's latest technological developments, refined through months of collaboration with the Kasari and the Orail Assembly, equipped our fighters with capabilities that would have seemed like impossible science fiction during those first uncertain weeks of the conflict. Grace's strategic planning, informed by everything Vex had shared about Voran psychology and command structure, had prepared coalition forces for tactics the enemy had not yet even considered deploying against us. But perhaps most significantly, we were no longer entirely alone. As the massive Voran fleet began its approach toward Earth's defensive perimeter, sensor arrays detected additional ship signatures entering the system from an unexpected vector, vessels bearing the distinctive design signatures of the Kasari and Orail Assembly, arriving not as passive observers this time, but as active participants in the defense of a world they had come to genuinely respect. They came, I heard Grace's voice through the comm, carrying a disbelief that mirrored the emotion spreading through every coalition pilot monitoring the same sensor data. They actually came. The battle that followed would later be remembered, across every civilization that had watched Earth's long struggle against Voran conquest, as the moment the Empire's long-standing dominance over this region of the galaxy finally, irrevocably broke. I fought through hours of combat that blurred together into a continuous stretch of adrenaline, strategy, and desperate courage, flying alongside pilots from Earth and, for the first time, alongside allied forces from civilizations who had finally decided the risk of open confrontation with the Voran Empire was worth taking. The turning point came roughly 6 hours into the battle, when coalition forces, using intelligence gathered from Vex about the specific vulnerabilities of the newly arrived Voran fleet commander, executed a coordinated strike against his flagship that mirrored, with even greater precision, the strategy that had destroyed the first command ship months earlier. This time the Voran fleet, though larger and more prepared than before, still could not fully counter the combination of human unpredictability and allied technological support now arrayed against them. I watched, from a position providing escort for the final strike team, as the second Voran command ship suffered the same catastrophic fate as its predecessor, sections of hull tumbling away into the darkness of space, as cascading system failures spread across the vessel that had once represented the full, terrifying might of an empire that had never before faced genuine, sustained resistance to its expansion. The remaining Voran fleet, Its command structure shattered for the second time in less than a year, began a chaotic, disorganized retreat that coalition forces, alongside our newly arrived allies, pursued only far enough to ensure the immediate threat to Earth had genuinely passed. Grace had insisted, during the final strategic planning sessions before this battle began, that total annihilation of the retreating fleet was neither necessary nor wise, understanding that a message of strength combined with restraint would serve Earth's long-term interests far better than an unlimited campaign of destruction against an enemy already thoroughly defeated. I landed back at base in the aftermath of that battle, exhausted in a way that went beyond simple physical tiredness, carrying the accumulated weight of everything this long war had cost, and everything it had ultimately achieved. Mia met me on the tarmac, her own exhaustion evident but tempered by something that looked, for the first time in longer than I could remember, genuinely close to peace. "It's over," she said, though there was a careful quality to her voice, an awareness that peace after a war this significant would never feel entirely simple or complete. "For now," I answered, echoing the same careful qualification Grant had offered after our first great victory, though this time, the words carried more hope than uncertainty. The weeks that followed brought a flood of diplomatic activity unlike anything Coalition Command had managed before, as news of Earth's second decisive victory against Voran forces spread rapidly across the network of civilizations that had been watching our long struggle with growing interest. Formal alliance agreements, negotiated with a confidence born from proven strength rather than desperate necessity, established Earth's position within a broader coalition of species now openly committed to challenging Voran dominance across the wider region. Vex, whose cooperation and insight had proven invaluable throughout the entire conflict, was offered, during a formal ceremony I attended alongside Grace and Commander Grant, the choice to remain on Earth as a formal liaison and advisor, a role he accepted with what I had come to recognize, over our long months of interaction, as genuine gratitude rather than simple pragmatic calculation. "I came to this world as part of a conquest that believed your species would fall easily, like every world before you," he told the assembled gathering, his translated voice carrying an emotional weight that felt remarkably human despite everything that separated us. "Instead, I found a species that redefined what resistance could mean, not just for yourselves, but for everyone who has lived under the shadow of an empire that claimed to be unstoppable. I am honored to remain here, among people who taught an entire galaxy that no conquest is ever truly guaranteed." I stood in the crowd during that ceremony, surrounded by Mia, Noah, Chloe, and countless others who had fought and sacrificed throughout this impossible war, and I found myself thinking back to that first terrible morning, standing on my balcony in Denver, watching black ships appear in a sky that had, until that moment, always felt safe and unremarkable. I could not have imagined, in that moment of pure shock and fear, everything that would follow: the battles, the losses, the alliances forged in desperation, and ultimately sustained through genuine mutual respect, the transformation of an entire fractured planet into something unified by necessity, and, eventually, by something closer to shared purpose. My father attended the ceremony as well, standing beside me during the final moments as coalition leadership formally announced the establishment of what would come to be known as the Sol Alliance, Earth's formal partnership with the Kasari, the Aureal Assembly, and several other civilizations who had joined the growing coalition, determined to prevent any future empire from repeating the kind of unchallenged conquest the Voran had pursued for so many generations. "Your mother would have been proud," he told me quietly, watching the formal proceedings with an expression that mixed grief and hope in a way I had come to understand intimately over the preceding 2 years of war. "Not just of what you accomplished, of what all of you accomplished together. This isn't just a victory for Earth anymore. It's a victory for every world that spent generations believing resistance was impossible." I thought about his words often in the months that followed, as Earth slowly began the long, difficult process of rebuilding from a war that had cost so much, even as it had ultimately secured our survival and reshaped our understanding of our place within a much larger galactic community. Cities damaged during the initial invasion and the infrastructure attacks that followed underwent extensive reconstruction, aided significantly by technology and resources shared through our new alliance network. Memorial sites were established across the globe, honoring the millions who had lost their lives throughout the conflict, permanent reminders of the cost that had purchased humanity's continued freedom. I continued serving within the newly restructured Sol Alliance Defense Forces, though the nature of my service shifted significantly as the years passed, moving gradually from active combat pilot toward training and strategic roles, sharing the hard-earned lessons of our war with new generations of pilots and with representatives from allied civilizations eager to understand exactly how a species with no prior interstellar military experience had managed to break the seemingly unbreakable pattern of Voran conquest. Mia remained by my side throughout this transition, our partnership deepening from wartime companionship into something that felt, as the years passed, like the foundation of an entirely new chapter of my life, one built not on desperate survival, but on genuine hope for whatever future we might build together, in this dramatically expanded understanding of our place within the galaxy. Noah continued his engineering work, eventually leading a joint research initiative between human and Kasari scientists that produced technological breakthroughs benefiting not just Earth, but the entire growing alliance network we had become part of. Chloe rose through coalition ranks with a speed that surprised no one who had witnessed her courage and instincts during those darkest days of the war, eventually taking command of her own squadron, training new pilots with the same hard-earned wisdom she had once received from those who fought before her. Grace Turner, whose strategic brilliance had shaped nearly every significant decision throughout the entire conflict, transitioned into a formal diplomatic role within the Sol Alliance, helping to navigate the complex, ongoing relationships with our various allied civilizations, while remaining a fierce, careful guardian of Earth's independence within that expanding network of partnerships. Commander Grant, eventually promoted to oversee the entirety of Earth's contribution to the broader Alliance defense structure, remained, throughout every subsequent challenge our new coalition faced, a steady, grounding presence that reminded everyone around him of the values that had carried us through our darkest hours. 5 years after the destruction of that second Voran command ship, I stood once again on a balcony, though this one belonged to a rebuilt section of Denver, standing not far from the site where my old apartment had once been, before that first terrible morning changed everything I understood about my world and my place within it. The sky above me held no threatening black ships, only the familiar blue of an ordinary afternoon, though I understood now, in a way I never could have before the war began, that this ordinary sky existed within a vast, complex universe, filled with civilizations who now knew Earth's name, who understood that this small, stubborn planet had done something no other world subjected to Voran conquest had ever managed to achieve. We had not simply survived, we had fundamentally changed the balance of power across an entire region of the galaxy, proving that even the most seemingly unstoppable empire could be challenged, could be forced to retreat, could ultimately be broken by a species willing to fight with everything it had, again and again, no matter how impossible the odds appeared. I often thought during quiet moments like that afternoon on my rebuilt balcony about the strange, terrible gift the Voran Empire had unknowingly given us through their attempted conquest. They had come expecting an easy victory against a primitive, divided world, and instead, they had forced humanity to discover a unity and resilience that might never have emerged under any less desperate circumstances. It was not a gift I would have ever chosen, given the devastating cost it demanded from so many families, including my own. But it was, undeniably, part of the complicated truth of everything we had become, through this long, brutal struggle for survival. The galaxy that had once watched Earth with cautious, distant curiosity, now understood something that would echo across generations of civilizations, still living under the shadow of empires that believed themselves unstoppable. A small, stubborn world, attacked without warning and expected to fall exactly as every world before it had fallen, had instead stood its ground, adapted, allied, and ultimately triumphed against odds that had once seemed absolute and unchangeable. They attacked Earth, believing it would be another easy conquest added to a long, unbroken history of expansion. Instead, they gave an entire galaxy something it had not witnessed in generations, proof that resistance was possible, that empires built on the assumption of endless conquest could be challenged and broken by those willing to fight for their survival, with everything they possessed. The galaxy had watched, uncertain and afraid, wondering if this small world would fall like all the others before it. Instead, they learned to tremble, not from fear of what humanity might become, but from the undeniable proof of exactly what we already were.